Because I know you already had a
All right,
plan.
how I want to start it off is the reason why I wanted to do this. All right, the reason why I wanted to do this was Graham Hancock was on Joe Rogan, and he invited Flint Dibble. It was his choice to invite him, and that was the thing that they did. Um, and it took 2 years for that podcast to come out, but in the meantime, there was some mudslinging that occurred, and by the time they actually had the debate, it was more about the mudslinging than the content. And one of the things that happened in that debate was you had a real time professional, um, academic person, sort of debunking Graham's statements in real time. And now I don't think Graham actually performed very well, but I think it was because he was too caught off guard about all the mudslinging that had occurred before having that debate. And you know, I made a couple response videos to some of the things that Flint had said. Um, and if there's anything I'll say about Graham, he's one of the more, if you're talking about the alternative history sphere, as I call it, he's one of the more factual guys that there is. I mean, he does real research. I don't agree with everything he says. There's quite a few things I don't agree with. I don't agree with like Bimini Road is man-made. I think it's natural. I don't think Yogoni is man-made. I think it's natural. But there are things I do agree with him about. And um, needless to say, you know, he sort of took it on the chin with Flint there, sort of real time debunking a lot of the things that he had to say. And I did a couple of response videos, so did Dan the Debunker, and a lot of things Flint said weren't actually on par with the truth. I'll say that to be polite, and I think we pointed that out. And then you have Billy Carson coming on Joe Rogan, and there's nobody there in real time to debunk the things that he's saying, and he's sort of just going off the cuff and saying lots of statements. And when I started to dig into the things that he was saying, man, I couldn't get past like 15 minutes, like we talked about, without finding a lot of things to counter as far as what he was talking about. Now, I'll say I don't follow a lot of these current alternative speakers. I don't follow like Uncharted X. I don't follow like Billy. I don't follow these guys. I'm old school. I go back to John Anthony West, Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, all these guys back in the day. So this is my background. And when I realized that there was a market for ideas on this type of stuff, I decided I would, put my voice forward and start speaking on all about it, because a lot of things I was hearing were either just people ripping off people that I respected and just repeating their words, or, you know, to be frank, a lot of nonsense. So I want to get down to the truth about ancient history and the past. I don't want to speculate. When I first got into it, making videos, you know, I was a little less serious about what I was talking about, and I would make sort of my own opinions, so to speak, about things that I saw. But I'll give credit to Dan the Dunker for basically making me get more serious about my research. And now, when I do my research, I actually review peer-reviewed papers, journals. I dig down to the truth. I find old books, from the 18th century and things like that. And what I learned is that there's a lot of knowledge that is sort of stowed away and tucked away that people don't have access to, which allows, for some grandiose ideas or concepts to be put out there. And I think it's important, if you want to be an alternative researcher, to not be, you know, outside the boundaries of reality, so to speak. And there are answers for this stuff, and sometimes the answers are a lot cooler than the speculation. And that's the part about it that I like. I like finding stuff that's, really interesting, even though it's not like speculative or, around the lines of ancient aliens type tier stuff. So that's why I thought it would be a good idea to, you know, respond to uh, what Billy had to say on JRE for the sake of um, alternative ancient history and for the sake of, you know, sort of standing up for Graham, who's a person that I really respect. Because if there was a real, if you want to call a Syrianologist or a person who knew cuneiform or a person like yourself who knows this stuff in and out, um, on that podcast, it would have went a lot different. So I think that what I want to try to do is be that sort of person between you and me and review the things that were said on that episode.
Appreciate that you want to do this with me, because it is important to, you know, show the other side of what your research has presented, because once somebody makes absolutes about something, that means that your research no longer matters and you should just follow what they say. And we're not here for that. We're here to actually understand what has been shared, or at least the closest to it, right?
Right. Absolutely. 100%. So do you want to cue up that first clip, or do you want me to do it?
They wrote, and when you see like some of the images that they created, the images that look like the double helix from DNA, and there's a bunch of the like that now we represent the caduceus, which is represents pharmacies and drugs. Like that's the old version of an image of the double helix of DNA, or at least it looks super similar to that.
Oh, it definitely is, because it's referenced even in the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other ancient texts.
When he's talking about the Caduceus and the Sumerian version, he throws to Billy and he says, "There's a version of that in the Book of the Dead." Um, the Caduceus or Caduceus, however you want to pronounce it, actually was two ribbons at first. It wasn't even progressed in ancient Greece. The ribbons became associated with snakes, and they became intertwined with Mercury. And there's a fresco from Pompeii called The Punishment of Ixon with Mercury holding the caduceus. Let me see if I can share my screen here and we can take a look at that image.
There we go.
So see, this is a fresco in Pompeii with Mercury holding the caduceus. Okay, it's not exactly what you would envision, but that's the truth. So I'm gonna stop sharing and we'll move on. When he refers to the Sumerian version, it's my belief that what he's actually talking about is the tree of life, depicted in many Assyrian reliefs. Many people misinterpret that as a double helix, but when you really look at it, it's not really showing that at all. And I'm going to show this Assyrian relief with the tree of life that many people misappropriate as caduceus. There it is. So right here we have the two, I think Lula or something like that, flanking the tree of life. Many people try to misappropriate this as a double helix. It's really not a double helix. Can you see that on there? Am I sharing it right?
Yep, I see it. I see it.
Okay. So let's move on. I think that's what Joe Rogan's referring to because that's what most people are familiar with. So let's keep going forward. So that's a Neo-Assyrian relief from 860 BCE. It's in the Nimrod Palace in modern-day Iraq. It shows a panel of eagle-headed winged protective spirits flanking the tree of life, performing an act of worship. But however, there is a Sumerian version of the caduceus, which is called the Ningishida, if I can pronounce that properly. It's fairly rare. That's why I don't think it's what Joe Rogan was referring to. but it can be found on ancient Babylonian cylinder seals. There's one that's been highlighted in a book that was printed in the 1800s called The Cylinders and Ancient Oriental Seals by Morgan J. Pierpont. And I will share that screen and we can look at that image as well. So here we see one of the very early prototype versions of the caduceus and a cylinder scroll. This is very rare. A lot of people, aren't very familiar with this. So that's why I don't think Joe's actually really referring to this, but it is sort of you can see the snakes here, the intertwining serpentine snakes wrapped around a center stem. All right, so we'll go forward. The best representation of the Nigashita can be seen in the libation vase of Gudea, which is circa 2100 BCE. And this is where we can clearly see the helical intertwined serpents around a center pole. So let me share the screen. We can look at that. So this is one of the only and best representations of what would be considered the ancient Sumerian caduceus. And there's not many others besides this one, other than the scrolls that I just previously showed. So moving on, the symbol is comprised of two snakes intertwined a rod, accompanied by two griffins, represented in Nigashita, the right hand scepter god. Nigashita was the heralder of earth and served as a liaison between the ruler and the mother goddess Ishtar, goddess of fertility, who worshipped Sumer as early as the Uruk period. Billy to say there's a representation of caduceus or Nigashita in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So let's talk about the so-called quote-unquote Book of the Dead. It isn't a solitary book in any sense. The term conjures up ideas, something out of the movie Evil Dead, but it's nothing like that at all, nor it is a single Book of the Dead. Even a proper translation of that term was coined in the 19th century. The proper translation is spells going forth by day. And there's no single book at all. It's a series of spells and guidance for the deceased to traverse the underworld after death and reach the other side and live for eternity. It can be found. There you go, buddy. That's the one. That is the one. That is the number one source that I retrieved my information from. It can be found written on tomb walls and papyruses. They were curated by scribes for each individual, and while there is a representation of a snake, as in spell 17, with the great cat Mao killing Apophis, the great serpent, enemy of the sun god Ra, with a knife, there is no version of the caduceus or Nigashita in the Book of the Dead, and my source, as you just pointed out, is the Oxford Handbook of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which you just showed. So that's excellent. Let me just share my screen real quick again. We can show Apophis. Apophis is in the Book of the Dead, but there is no intertwining snake whatsoever in the Book of the Dead. So let's see what we got here. It's taking a little time. There we go. We can see it. Here's the cat, which represents Ra severing Apophis, who's around the tree of life. So there's similarities between the two, but they're not exact. And I think that's important to point out. Mm-hmm. So moving forward, now there is what's called the Book of the Secret Chamber, or the Imdiwat, which describes the sun god Ra's journey through the 12 divisions of the netherworld at night. There are many representations of serpents in this, with the most extensive surviving version being found on the walls of tomb for Tutmosis III. In the fourth hour of Indawat, there is a realm Ra encounters a zigzag pathways represented by a multi-headed snake. I can show all of these. I don't want to bog it down too much, but let's see what we can do. So as the sun god Ra, so what the Egyptians believed is that when the sun set and went beyond the horizon through the night, it traversed a bunch of trials and tribulations. And each hour was accompanied by a certain trial that the sun disk had to traverse. So here we see a three-headed snake. In the seventh hour, Ra encounters Apophis, who attempts to ground his solar barge. This is all from Tutmosis III. Here is Apophis trying to ground the barge. And he's unsuccessful, and he's severed into multiple pieces. In the eighth hour, he's cutting to the chase. Let's go. We have the 10th hour. We see a similar to the Caduceus and Nigasha. This is the only one that is similar. In the 10th hour, this panel is showing the sun god Ra's soul merging with Osiris, initiating the process of regeneration and rebirth, my friend, as the sun dies and is sunset only to be reborn at dawn. And we can see here that this is the only representation that could be sort of assimilated with the Caduceus or the Nigazaga, but it has an entirely different meaning. And although it's similar, I wouldn't say it's exactly the same at all. It's interesting enough to say that, different cultures had similar motifs, but I think it's reckless to try and say they're identical or the same. So to say that it's legitimately the same thing had different meanings, and they had different reasons for each culture and each representation. So, while he's not totally off base, I think the facts are more interesting than making a generalization. I think is what I'm getting at.
And you're saying that he's just the source that he's using is incorrect, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where he gets it. I have many representations of the Book of the Dead, and there is no helical snake representation in the actual Book of the Dead. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that there is no quote unquote singular Book of the Dead, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
The Book of the Dead is a collection of tomb reliefs and papyruses that were basically purchased for each individual in order for them to traverse the underworld and make it to the afterlife. It's fascinating, it's interesting, but there's no reason to put false attributions upon these things. Like they're interesting enough on their own right, without making inappropriate correlations. And I think that does a disservice to anybody doing this research.
And I agree with you. And I say that because it seems like he picks a version of the Book of the Dead for his narrative. It doesn't fit the whole general idea of what the Book of the Dead is, because the Book of the Dead, like you said, was generally for the individual. Everybody had their own journey to the afterlife.
Right.
There may be some similarities, of course, right?
Right, like the weighing of the heart was essential.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is that there are going to be similarities, especially when there's an afterlife. I mean, we journey through life as from a baby to an adult to an elder person, and why wouldn't we have a journey on the afterlife if they believe that there's an afterlife, right? Especially when they talk about it so much in saying that each Book of the Dead is for that individual person. their journey is going to be differently, their outcome is going to be different. And that's what I seen too, because when I hear people say the Book of the Dead says that, I said, well, which version?
Right.
That's the one thing that I
What
always say.
edition?
Yeah, exactly. And then they say, what you mean there's only one? I said, no, there's many. Matter of fact, the one you may be reading might be for one dead person, the one that I might be reading for might be for another one.
Yeah. And from my research, what I learned is that it became a commodity near the end of the Egyptian dynasties. It started off as something that was only for the royals, but it became something of, a merchant type deal where you could buy different versions. You could buy a package. It was almost like a subscription service where you could get, how many spells do you want? You want 10 spells? You want 9 spells? You want 17 spells? It's going to cost you. I can give you 8 spells for this much. I can give you 12 spells for that much. I can give you the grand package of 17 spells for this much. And it all depended on, the finances of the particular individual. So, a lot of it is mystified and deified in the modern times. Um, you know, like that's the reality. Like, and reality to me is much more interesting than misappropriation.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this stuff is much more fascinating when you get down to the truth of it than what some of the alternative researchers talk about today.
Yeah, I agree with you. The story is fascinating, enjoyable already by itself. You can literally make a great sci-fi movie from it already. You don't have
Yeah,
to, exaggerate what's already out there. This stuff is already fascinating. And
right.
that's
Why
what
do I need to embellish?
yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's go on to the second clip.
Is that exists,
Yeah.
and that it's so hard for people to put in their brain 5,000 years of time,
Yeah.
and that there's these people that have this very bizarre language. Like
Yeah.
when you look at that language, we don't even know what it sounds like, right?
Right. No, and the language popped up out of nowhere.
What he might have said about the caduceus and whatever, that it could be construed as me like parsing things or whatever. It wasn't in the Book of the Dead, it was in this other book. Okay, that's fine. It's a minor discrepancy, but this is an absolutely ridiculous statement. I mean, so let me just get into it. He said it came out of nowhere. Actually, it developed over hundreds of years, from 3,500 BCE, approximately, what's called as pictograms or proto-cuneiform, as it reached 3,200 BCE. The pictographic symbols morphed into phonograms, which are symbolic representations of sounds. And it was first noted in the city of Uruk, and eventually syllograms, which are symbols that represent syllables, in or around 2,900 to 2,300 BCE, the early dynastic period. It became a full-fledged writing system at that time. Cuneiform was used by all the great civilizations that emerged from Mesopotamia, including the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Emilites, etc. Previous even pictographic writings were tokens. This is the most fascinating thing, this is where it really gets interesting. These tokens go back upwards of 8,000 BCE. The tokens were used as counters to keep track of goods. They were the earliest code system and signs for transmitting information. Each token shape was semantic, referring to a particular unit of merchandise. For example, a cone or a sphere stood respectively for a small or large measure of grain. I'm going to share my screen right now. They have extensively researched, and that's why I really take umbrage with this stuff, because the facts are there. You just have to look. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We can take a look at this stuff right here. So here we have the geometric shapes. Each one of these geometric shapes represented a certain or specific thing. And at some point near 3500 BCE, they realized they could represent these tokens as markings on clay instead of the tokens themselves. And that's when we see this. So, instead of having a conical shape and a sphere, they marked it into a piece of clay. So here we have the conical shape, here we have the sphere, and here we have the representation, and they put it into clay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second here and go on. Around 3200 BCE, give or take, pictograms and tokens morphed into proto-cuneiform. And this is how writing evolved. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. It's much more fascinating than to say it came out of nowhere. It actually didn't come out of nowhere. It was a series of converging events that led to the first system of writing, which is fascinating, utterly on its own face. So I'm going to give you an example of where pictograms evolved with the representation of the shapes, what were they called? Tokens. The tokens. Sorry.
That's I use that same website you got that stuff from.
Yeah.
For my first article on my website. I know
nice.
Exactly. I know exactly what you're talking about and where you got that from too.
So let me show you where, or show our audience, since you already know, where the pictograms met the tokens in the form of being engraved on clay. So here we can see the engravings that represent the tokens, and here we can see the pictograms. This is a pictogram tablet featuring an account of, and the thing about this is how this generated was from commerce, which is the most interesting part of it. This represents 33 measures of oil from Godin Tepe in Iran. And here we have another representation of a tablet showing pictograms. And I'm going to scroll down real quick so everyone can see. This is the sort of the evolution of pictogram to cuneiform. So we have a head, then it was tipped on the side, and then it became lines, and then it became this. And this is the evolution here. And this is well researched. There's no ambiguity about this. It did not come out of nowhere. It took hundreds of years, maybe even thousands, when you consider the token origin of these, which was 8000 BCE, which is far more interesting and far more fascinating than to say that it came out of nowhere. And the tokens aligned with the pictographs and then eventually became a writing system. So, this is why I don't like generalizations. This is why I don't like making things up on the fly. The facts are there. If you go and you dig deep and you find them, you will find them. Actually, I have another one here. Let me share real quick. Sorry about that. Here's another one. And I will all the source links to all of this. It's difficult to mention them on the fly, but when we have this uploaded and curated and edited, I will post all of the source links. So here's another one. It's a pictograph, early Babylonian, Assyrian, and then what they mean. So, it became a picture of a bird and then turned into this word. It became an ox that looked like this and then turned into this word. So, cuneiform writing evolved over at least hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. So it did not come out of nowhere by any stretch of the imagination. All right, that's what I got for that segment.
So yeah, I wrote down what you said. So pictographic scripts. So like I said, that's the same website that I found that I used to understand the writing system for the Sumerians. And like I said, I have this book right here, right? The Ancient Literature of Sumer. And I want to show you something that I'm going to bring up because while you was doing that and showing that stuff,
It's coming up. Let me see now. It's coming
Mhm.
up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see it.
So this is the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. So what you
Hmm.
talked about was the okay. So what we do know is the Sumerians weren't the first people to inhabit that land. It was the Ubadians. The Ubadians actually inhabited that land, and
Okay.
what I've learned from my research is that's where you get most of the reptilian stuff from. But we'll get into that later.
All right.
They don't have a time frame exactly for Ubadians, but it was definitely before the Sumerians, right? And
Hmm.
I took a class from Bar Ilan University, and Dr. Nili Samet from the class, she said that the Mesopotamia, because she doesn't say Sumerian or Akkadian, she says the Mesopotamian writing system started
That
around
makes sense.
3200 BC.
Yeah,
So,
that's when it was sort of collated. Around 3200 BCE is when it became actually a written
mhm,
with syllables. I have more information about that I probably don't have queued up right now, but it evolved from so pictographic to um, another term I can't recall right now at this time, but there's three processes in which it became. So there was pictographic, and then syllabic, and then another one
mhm,
where it broke it down into actual, So there's like words where we have multiple syllables inside of them. So yeah, I mean, by 3200 BCE, it's when it became a full fledged written language. But it arrived at like from if you can imagine like three rivers flowing into a major river, and that's how language first started. There was the pictographic, there was
mhm.
the token, and then there was the syllabic, and then they all intertwined. And at one point, that then it became a full-fledged language around
Right.
3200, 3100 BCE. It's a little bit muddled or disputed exactly, but that's the approximate timeline.
Right. And that's about what I've learned too. And the reason why I brought that up is because you can see a pictographic script from around the world. All that it means is just basically, I mean, hieroglyphics are considered pictographic scripts,
Absolutely.
right? So that right there alone tells me that, we've been doing that. We've been communicating through pictures for way before the Sumerians came around, right? And even way
Yeah,
before the
absolutely.
Ubadians, right? And then, like you said, how it translated and changed more into, what we know as what 3200. But what's interesting is when I look at the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, they give you one set of dates. They say third and early second millennium BCE, right? And this book is the same thing, right? This book is the same
Yeah.
thing as the website, like completely the same. I guess is the updated version, and they give a date around being 18th. Let me make sure I quote it correctly. It says clay tablets dating to the 18th century BCE. So that just lets me know that that's more around the Babylonian time frame.
Right.
But I want to give you something that I found out. So my mom bought me a 1873 Holy Bible. I have it right up here in front of me. And when I'm reading through it, and when I read through it, and I posted it on my YouTube, I learned that Babylon, Chaldea, and Shinar/Sumer is all in the one and the same. It was
Mm,
actually all called Chaldea.
okay.
So that kind of gives you an idea of how now instead of following the Sumerians and saying like the Sumerians it just came out of nowhere, that's not necessarily true
No, it
because
did. It's not at all.
yeah,
So, I can just interject there. There was in Babylonian, there was northern and southern.
mm-hmm,
Okay. So, northern was Assyria, and southern was Sumerian. And they were not unique, but they were distinct from each other. And lots of times, and maybe later on in this presentation, because we're only doing 15 minutes at a time, because my God, it's so much to unpack, as they say. We'll get into it, but a lot of what's attributed to Sumerian is actually Assyrian. And I've been posting that on my X channel over the course of researching all this data. So there's a lot of conflation that occurs. So what you just said makes total sense to me.
Yeah, Babylon was actually the capital according to my 1873 Bible, and I'll send you a picture of it in a little while. Like I said, I have it on my YouTube channel. Is the capital of Chaldea. So that's what makes me know more about the idea of it not just happening out of nowhere. And then, for instance, like you said, the Sumerians get a lot of stuff from the Sumerians, or at least your research showed that, right? I also learned that everybody takes what the Sumerian or what the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and so on and so forth, and they say that the Sumerians said it, but the Sumerian civilization only lasted but so long. Once the Akkadians took over, it was pretty much just a free for all from there.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think when we get into the next portion, we're going to learn that cuneiform was not something that only the Sumerians did. Cuneiform was something that was used by multiple cultures um, out of Mesopotamia. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot more complex and interesting than to try to boil everything down to a single culture or a single source, you know? So let me get up the next video.
So what are the first decipherings? Like, what year was the first deciphering?
It was in 1800. I think around 1850. George Smith. He actually worked at the I believe it was Cambridge.
Let's get into it, right?
Now you know who you gonna give credit to.
Yeah. We just heard some say that George Smith was the first person to decipher cuneiform. Okay. Well, there have been many predecessors before him. There was Friedrich Munter, a German scholar who discovered the word king in the late 1700s. He published this work after Carson Niebuhr, a German cartographer, copied ruins from the Persepolis. So I can show a screen here. Let me share the screen a little bit. The history of this is fascinating. It took a lot of people and a lot of effort to decipher cuneiform writing, and it was a step-by-step process. It did not just happen where George Smith just figured this out by himself. In fact, it was already deciphered before George Smith ever even looked at cuneiform writing. So let's see here. Let me see this. What's going on?
Yep, I see it.
All right. So right here, Friedrich Munter, a German scholar, discovered the word king in cuneiform writing after this individual, Carson Niebuhr, a German cartographer, copied them from the ruins at Persepolis in 1778. Like, this shit is incredible. Like, it goes way fucking back. Next was George Grodenfeld in 1802, a German epigraphist. He extended this work by realizing the king's name is often followed by a great king of kings and the name of the king's father. All right. So this was some of his decipherings right here. He published his work in 1815. Incredible. I mean, this is just amazing stuff. He was followed in 1822 by Antoine Jean Saint Martin, a French Orientalist, who was able to confirm that the corresponding words in the cuneiform script Xerxes, Zazara, and Xerxes, the great king, which he published in 1823. And here's his sum of work right here. Here's his sum of her work. I mean, this is just fascinating stuff. Like, It did not come out of nowhere, and George Smith is not the first person. Then along came Rasmus Christian Rask, a Danish linguist, who was able to identify the letter M, which allowed for the decipherment of the supreme god Ahura Mazda and Archimedes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
Next came Emile Bernoff, a French scholar in 1836. After viewing the inscriptions published by Nibiru, he discovered they contained a list of satrapies of Darius. These are governors of the king for different various regions that they represented for the king. From that, he was able to identify 30 letters. In the early 1800s, from 1833 to 1835, Christian Lasson, a German orientalist, contributed significantly to the grammatical understanding of Old Persian language and the use of vowels. In the final step of decipherment, the trilingual Bayestun, which is an inscription, a multilingual Achaemenid royal inscription on a large rock relief on the cliff of Mount Behistun in the Kermanshah province of Iran in 5000 BCE. This was completed by Henry Wellens, a British officer and
Mm-hmm.
Orientalist who published 4 books in the 1850s. And Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman and Assyrianologist. Edward Hincks discovered that Old Persian is partly syllabary. And he was put to a blind test with several other contemporaries at the time. Edwin Norris, a British linguist, Henry Rawlinson, a British officer and Orientalist, and Julius Upper, a French Syrianologist. The group was referred to as the Holy Trinity of Cuneiform. They were each given a copy of a previously undeciphered script to see if they would all translate it in the same manner, and they did. So this is not to say that George Smith didn't translate anything. He most certainly did, and is well published. He's first credited for deciphering of many of the ancient Sumerian epics, specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh, but he's not nowhere near the first to decipher cuneiform.
Yeah. I mean, I've knew that there were other people that came. I didn't have a list like you did, but I definitely knew that there were people who came before George Smith. I mean, the person that found the tablets, this guy right here, I'll show you right now. You know who that is, right?
Hold on a second. I got something I want to share. Let me move this aside. Hold on. Hold on. Because I didn't share my source. Where are you at? Okay, here we are. I actually want to give you the source for everything I was just talking about, because it's not random. It's actually um, well researched, which is what I do, which is what you do, which is why this is important.
And I don't think George Smith worked or George Smith.
For Cambridge.
Yeah, I don't think he worked at Cambridge. I think it
I
was I think it
didn't
was
even look at that because I was so focused on like the facts regarding the. All right, so I'm gonna give you the source for,
I gotta check
and then
that
you
out.
can go ahead because I know you had it ready. But let me just give you the source for all that with which I was just talking about. Um, it's a book from the early 19th century. Uh, and this is what I'm talking about. I dig deep for this stuff. I don't mess around. So let me see here. So here we go. Everything I was just talking about uh, comes from this. The archaeology of the cuneiform inscriptions. Okay, this is a book from, I think, the early 18th century. It highlights everything I was just talking about. So, this is why it's important to do real research, and not just speculate with your own opinions. I think what I laid forth and what you already know is far more interesting to say than it came out of nowhere, because
Yeah.
that's ridiculous. All right, here we go. I'll let you go ahead and show what you have to show.
Yeah, I was just this guy right here. Here's that guy that found the Epic of Gilgamesh tablets.
Oh, wow. Yes. Early 19th century. Nice. Yeah. I
He's
mean,
here, let me
to say that like George Smith was the first one and it came out of nowhere. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
let's
he
get our
didn't
facts
translate.
straight. Let's be real. That's what I'm trying to do.
The craziest version of this story is that they genetically engineered us out of lower primates and put us here to mine gold.
Right.
And then established different types of civilizations and taught us how to build things, taught us all these different things. And enough time has passed that we've kind of forgotten. Enough time has passed. That's the wackiest version of it, right?
Right. That's the bare bones minimum.
Yeah, the wackiest versions that they made us, which is we've talked about this a couple of times, but how bizarre it is that human beings have this incredible.
In the Epic of Atrahasis, we have the mother god Mami was assigned the task of creating humans. She shaped clay figurines mixed with flesh and blood of the slain god Geshu-E. Geshu-E is described as a god who had intelligence, which implies that humans were intended to be rational. Okay, so let's go there. That's the first version of this epic from the Sumerians. All right, so the next one is the the Emu Elish. Okay, and in the Emu Elish, we have a slightly different story. Humans were created from the blood of a slain god with the purpose to create servant gods for or slaves for the servant gods. So we have slightly two different interpretations of epics from the period, none of which talk about primates, none of which talk about, and we'll get into this maybe later, gold from Nibiru and any of this crap. And, from my research, we have to understand this as a basis of fact from the premise of what we're talking about. You look back at what we talked about earlier. Cuneiform language has been explicitly interpreted. There's no ambiguity. It's known, right? So people can read this verbatim, right? There's no confusion at all whatsoever. And Zechariah Sitchin comes in way after the fact and quite frankly makes up a lot of total fucking garbage that people are still listening to today. And what I just pointed out from both of these epics, which are the only two epics that talk about the creation of man, they don't prescribe to anything to do with modifying a hominid on Earth or anything like that. They're simply creation myths, like any other culture has creation myths at all. There's no talk of DNA manipulation or any of this stuff that Zachariah Sitchin wants to imply or talk about, or Billy Carson wants to suddenly agree to, even after saying, like, I don't listen to anything that dude has to say. So, Rebirth, what do you got to say? Because I feel like I've, exhausted my knowledge on this.
Well, the creation story to me is interesting because, like I said, you don't get it in 5,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. You get it around 1800 BC. That's maybe 3,500 years ago, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken, right? So they're pushing the timeline, saying this is what was said 5,000. Now I know a lot of people will say, well, these cuneiform tablets were based on traditional oral stories from
Right.
older civilizations, but the Atra Hasis, or however you said it, I heard it said other way, so that's why I said it that way too. And the Enuma Elish, that comes from a later time frame, which is around the same time as frame as what I just read from that book or from the electronic text corpus. So it's not like it came from 3200 BC when the
Right.
Sumerians showed on the scene. By the time this stuff was written down, it was no longer the Sumerians. It was the Sumerian language, yes. It was their cuneiform, yes.
Right.
But it wasn't no longer that civilization. It was either the Babylonian civilization or the Chaldean civilization, if you
Yeah,
want.
it was around 850 BCE, right?
Exactly, which comes way after the fact, right?
Right.
Way after the fact. So to say, hey, they that the Sumerians said this, that, and the third, you exaggerate when you say that because they didn't say that. It was you should say the Babylonians said that or the Chaldeans said that, and you should explain that civilization. It shouldn't be all, hey, the Sumerians said this,
Right,
right?
which is what we talked about earlier, and the fact that all of these cuneiform writings transpose multiple cultures, and they've been sort of like, uh, boiled down to, you know, Sumerian for the lack of real intelligent
Yeah,
research. And it's sad. And this is what we're here for. We don't want to deal with this type of thing. Like, no, they're the Akkadians, the Assyrians, all of this stuff. They're multidisciplinary. They span generations. Even the earlier linguists who translated this stuff, which I didn't really get into because this is a tough format, they pointed out that there was at least three languages originally noted on the first cuneiform texts that were
yeah,
translated
yeah.
early in the 18th century. So, like, to try to boil this down to like some one significant thing is very myopic.
No, I agree with you because from my research is I learned that in a lot of cases, when they found these cuneiform tablets, they couldn't tell if it was from the Sumerians or the Akkadians. The only
Right.
reason why they gave it one through to the other is the location that they found it. But it's not to say somebody might traveled with it from somewhere and brought it to another location, right?
Yeah.
So, and we know that the Akkadians were trading with the Sumerians at the time.
Yeah, they
They
were.
have they
Yeah.
have the same. What's confusing to me is that they said that their language was different, but their cuneiform is almost identical.
Yeah. And I think that is speculation, right?
Yeah,
Like, I've heard this comment before, like, we don't know how they vocalize these words. I mean, you know, I
yeah.
bet I could dig down and find out from a linguist that that's actually not true. But there's not enough time in the day to dissect all of this stuff. We're doing the best we can, and it's people like us that want to find the truth. And I think you're alluding to a fact that makes sense. Like, yeah, obviously there's a way to frenetically understand how they pronounce these words, because they was all cuneiform, right? um, it may be some differential differences, but, like, take a look at, like, Spanish or the Hispanic language, right? There's multiple ethnic groups that share the same common language, and there might be slight differences, but they're minuscule compared to the overall context of the language. So, therefore, you can attribute that back to this time period in, Mesopotamia, where things were evolving rapidly. And that's the most interesting thing to me is like this shit, you know, unlike what Billy had to say, it did not appear out of nowhere. This stuff was not like magical. It progressed. It progressed, and that is fascinating to me. That's from tokens like a spheroidal object or a conical object that represented some type of goods, and then they decided, hey, listen, I don't need to make this object. I can skew it into a piece of clay, and then that became a thing. And then on the same time, simultaneously, they were doing pictographic things like where a foot and a head was a representation of a foot and a head.
Yeah.
And then these two things morphed together and became written language. This is fact. This is
Yeah.
not disputable. And it took hundreds, maybe even thousands of years to occur. And it's much more fascinating to say than other than, oh, this came from nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of struck me too because you know, let's be honest, the universal language is mathematics, right?
Absolutely.
You know, that's one way to communicate. You don't have to know somebody's language to trade with them if you're selling something. Hey, one of these for two of those. You know,
Right.
it's not hard to point, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, and to see how people would have taken that to um, a way of, hey, stop, you know, if you're in the middle of in your marketplace under your tent and you're sitting down, you'll hate to get up every 2 seconds to tell somebody the price, right? So you would make
Right.
you a sign, one of these for two of those, and however you would do that would be easily, one and then two. And
Yeah.
then somebody would draw that out, and that would be a start of being an artistic way of writing. And we see
Absolutely.
pictographic scripts all over the world. We've seen them in what they have some found in the French caves that go back 15
Yeah.
to 30,000 years or something like that. I can't remember.
You're hitting on shit that's right in my wheelhouse right now
Yeah,
because the historical record continually denies the uh, epilogically sequence of numerology. There has to be a point when numbers and counting came into place. And some of the things that you just talked about, I've highlighted on my channel. There is obvious to me, like 200, 300,000 year old evidence of counting, where you're literally doing like the hangman type scratch, where you like cross right, cross left, cross left, and then you cross it off. And you say, okay, that's five.
yep,
There is no disputing that that is a substantial reality, because if you have let's look at it. If you have a tribe to feed, you have X amount of people, and then you slay a prey item, and you have to divide that prey item amongst your people. What are you going to do? You're going to do math. You're going to do math, bro. You're going to do math, and you're going to figure out how many portions do I need to divide amongst my people in order for them to survive. And anthropologists and archaeologists and historians greatly discount the idea of mathematics in the historical record. So, on a side note, I totally agree. Um, Maybe we should get back on track with our thing, though.
you know, it just makes me wonder for somebody to say that this just came out of nowhere. You just forget all the history before that. So for him to cry that the history is being forgotten, he's forgetting the history before that when he says that it just came out of nowhere. At least that's how I feel, honestly, because
Well, yeah,
language has been, I mean, if you really look at it, the cuneiform script was just a way for people to, was like you said, agriculture, for commerce. It was for trade. They needed to learn how to sell with each other, and tokens was a way of trading. You know, hey, two of these for three of those, you would get. That's how you would trade. It was simple. It was
yeah,
very simple. And then people started telling their stories and said, hey, let's start putting these stories into our writing system. And that's how we got where we're at now. But it also got the thing is like you said, if Zachariah Sitchin made a claim, he should be able to prove it.
Now, when you read Zachariah Sitchin's book, he talks about this in the 1970s. His description of it was that they needed to suspend gold particles in the atmosphere because their atmosphere was being destroyed. What, the supposed story is, it's very common on Earth, very rare on Nibiru.
Right. Yeah, that's the story. And now when I started looking into this gold thing myself, and here's what I came up with. So when you start analyzing the text, you discover that there was an encampment in a place called South Africa at Adam's Calendar. Okay. Now at Adam's Calendar, there's actually the very first gold mines discovered. They're dating them back to about 200,000 years ago. And that's incredible because there's a building there that looks like a worn down structure.
Yeah. All right. So a couple of things before I get into that. One of the things I wanted to avoid in this was, critiquing what Joe Rogan had to say, because that's really not the point of this for me. Joe Rogan is a personality. He's a host. He's doing his thing. He's a layman, so to speak, right? Billy Carson puts himself off as an ancient history alternative expert, right? And that's, our sphere, our realm is the alternative ancient history sphere. And so I wanted to address specifically the things he had to say. It's funny. I didn't play the clip, but anyone who watched that episode, right in the very beginning, he says he doesn't follow anything that Zachariah Sitchin says. He doesn't follow Zachariah Sitchin. He follows the early people who translated cuneiform text. But, at this point of the conversation, they're already talking about Zachariah Sitchin talking points. Now, I searched through all the epics, and as far as I can tell, and you can go ahead on this later before we get into the Adam's Calendar, there's no discussion of gold mining in any of the ancient Sumerian epics or texts. So when he says he analyzes the text, I'm not really sure what he's referring to. Have you come across anything like that, Rebirth, as far as gold mining in the Sumerian texts?
Well, okay, so in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, you can do a simple search, right? And it does have here, and I'll screen share it for you so you can see it for yourself. So because it's not necessarily something like that's what they were trying to do, like that's what their overall thing was, right? If you look right here, it's under the title Enki and the World Order.
Enki and the World Order, C 1.1.3. I will admire its green cedars. Let the lands of Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun look upon me, upon Enki. Let the Dilmun boats be loaded with timber. Let the Magan boats be loaded sky high. Let the Magalum boats of Meluha transport gold and silver and bring them to Nibru for Enlil, king of all the lands.
Okay.
So
now, is this considered an epic or?
Well, this is just from the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature.
Okay.
And it also has it. I don't have the book with me. It's also in that book that I showed you last time.
I know.
Yeah. So take that how you want to. You know what I mean?
But at least that makes me feel a little better about what he's saying to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get into the next part about this Adam's calendar.
Mm-hmm.
I looked into this Adam's calendar myself just recently because I thought it was interesting. And Adam's calendar is a site in South Africa, as he pointed out, that is sort of confusing
Right.
because it's really two different sites. There is a set of standing stones organized in a fashion that may be considered like a solar calendar. And then there
Right.
is this structure that he's talking about, which is a bunch of stacked slate stone. So let me go ahead and get into that here. The
Yeah, the Adams calendar is a very controversial subject. Very controversial.
yeah, the so let me go ahead and I'm gonna share my screen here.
It's also known as the Inky's calendar, so that's interesting too. But I know
Where did
exactly
you
what you're
see
talking
that?
about.
Yeah.
Where did I see that at? That's a good question because I've known. Okay, so for one, there's this guy named Dr. Supreme Understanding. That's actually his 5%er name. If you know anything about 5%ers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, he has many books out there. And I know that he talks about it in his books because he says that it's not actually a site like Zachariah Sitchin says. It's actually it was for cow enclosure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. That's this thing here.
Yep. That's the one. Yep, that's the one. That is the one. Or
So
at least that's the one I
this is the
think it is.
structure that some people call Adam's calendar. And this is, as you said, a cow enclosure. So this has actually been researched and studied. It goes to a specific tribe. So I'll pull that up. And it's really not that much of a mystery.
Yeah.
So one we were looking at right there, I won't even try to pronounce that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it's a heritage site. You can see a close up of the enclosure right here. It's a bunch of stacked shale stones, and it belonged to a specific tribe. So here's more of it here. The Bakoni people, and it's only about 500 years old, and this is well known. So claiming this is like 200,000 years old, I have no idea what anyone would get that information from regarding this particular site here. This is well known as a cow enclosure from a specific tribe, only about 500 years old. Now there's a second site, and I'll pull that up, that's in this vicinity, that is also called Adam's calendar, and it gets conflated. And that is almost like I don't want to use Stonehenge, but almost like a series of standing stones. So let me get that up.
Yeah, while you're doing it, that's interesting because I was so confused when I learned about this for the first time because I was like, why are they saying two different sites? Is somebody messing this up? And that's why I learned that some of them call it Adams and Inky's calendar. I don't know exactly where I learned that at, but I know the counter argument was from Dr. Supreme Understanding saying that it was a cow enclosure. And I was like,
Yeah.
but
So
I was like, and that's when I learned that there were two sites that are being considered the Adams calendar.
yeah, here we go, right here. So this is also called Adam's calendar, and it's also called the same stone ruins, yet it's completely different. And this is an alternative site. Okay. And so they have a series of images like this of standing stones in the ground. And I found this personally intriguing myself. I really wanted to look into it. But all you get are sort of a photo like this with some stones, and then another photo with more stones. And then you get these like 3D representations like this. And they say it aligns with certain constellations, but there's no real. Here we go. We have another one. This is computer generated. This isn't a real image. They've superimposed these stones, and it looks cool, but there's no real actual images other than these partial images that we first saw here. Now, if I saw a overhead of all of these stones that looked like those 3D representations, then I'd be more apt to, actually even talk about this on my channel. But I just find this very flimsy. And the fact that they're conflating two different sites here, this is the same name that was used for the cow enclosure that we just saw. So, and this is where the 200,000-year-old claim that Billy's talking about comes from, because they say that this aligns with certain constellations and the sun, here 75,000 years ago up to 160,000 years ago. So all kinds of different numbers are thrown out. And I really, I love stuff like this, but I can't find enough concrete anything to even corroborate this, especially when they're conflating two different sites.
Especially repeating something that may be incorrect. You're just repeating something instead of
saying, absolutely.
And then repeating the one that's the latest at that. They went from what 75,000 to 160,000 is, he said 200,000 or something.
He said 200,000. People are just throwing numbers out there. You know what I mean? And seeing whatever sticks to the wall. Now, he goes on to talk about that there are gold mines in the area. And it's true, there are gold mines in that area. They're by far not 200,000 years old, not even close. So there's a gold mine in that area. They're called the Barberton Mines. They're in the vicinity of the Fairview and Sheba, and they've been around for about 130 years. And let me tell you something about metallurgy. There's no ambiguity with dating mines. This is perfect science. So if anybody wants to say, well, you're just a mainstream shill or whatever, I hate to break it to you. There's a mine there, but it's only 130 years old. Nowhere near 200,000. In fact, the claim that he's making is that there's a 200,000-year-old mine is utterly false. The oldest mine in the world is in the country of Georgia, which borders Turkey and Russia. It's called Sanctris, and it's about 3rd or 4th millennium BC. So 3,000, 4,000 BC or BCE, however you want to term that. And I actually have an image of that mine itself. I'll pull it up and we can look at it. So, this claim of a 200,000-year-old mine being at Adam's calendar. Adam's calendar is like two different things. We know one of those things is a cow enclosure that dates only 500 years ago. We know that the standing stones, although intriguing, aren't well documented. So here we can see this is the mound. This is the 3,000 to 4,000-year-old gold mine. This is considered the oldest gold mine in the world, and it's in the country of Georgia. So, I don't know where he's getting that stuff from, and I don't know. He says he literally saw it in the text. I'm glad you pointed out at least there is some talk of gold in the text, but I think what you're doing, or what we're seeing him do here, is making giant stretches with very fragmented amount of information, kind of making things up as they go. And, for me as an independent researcher, honestly, it's embarrassing, and I can't respect that type of behavior. We're in a fight here with academia on a daily basis, trying to get to some truths where they have their own ghosts in their own closets. We don't need stuff like this, painting everybody with a broad brush and a bad brush, So I thought this is one of his worst segments and the most important to talk about from my perspective.
No, I agree with you because first of all, I did point out the fact that there is some mention of gold in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, right? And if Billy Carson is using that same source, he would also know that he would know that the Sumerians never talked about a planet Nibiru, and that the Sumerians didn't know more than 5 planets, right? And that it was actually called Nibiru, and it was a city in Mesopotamia. That's what the Sumerians said, right? So you can't take a source from one thing and say one thing to create a narrative, and then take another thing from a different place from a later time period and say, hey, well, they talk about gold here, and they're saying planet Nibiru comes around every 3,600 years, and they needed gold for their planet. It doesn't say that in the Sumerian text. Now it does say that they did use gold, and they had gold, but not only gold, but they had other things too, right? They had different crystals and everything, right? So it wasn't just about the gold. But yes, there is mention of that, but there's no mention of needing it for no planet, though.
I think this is a good segue into the next 2 segments.
Now, in the tablets, it talks about the fact that the Igigi, who were the working class Anunnaki beings who were cleaning out the Euphrates and Tigris River so they can create irrigation and create a bustling civilization. Also, they were doing the actual construction themselves. No people needed, just them working. They were like the construction workers, and Anu and Enki and Enlil, these leader gods, were like the foremen, the master architects and so forth, right? The boss. So these people were working, but they weren't supposed to be enslaved. They were volunteers. They got tired of doing the work, according to them, for about 250,000 years of labor on Earth, and also, according to them, on Mars. This is in the text. They call it Lamu. And so they decided to go to war against Enki and Lil and Anu because their demands had not been met. So they went to meet them in the Epic of Atrahasis. They go to Adam's calendar. They go to that same structure that was discovered where that gold mine is located.
All right.
Yeah. So I don't know anything about the idea about the Igigi being a working class, or in the Anu, Enki, and Enlil being the leader gods. I'm sure I spoke to you about this before. I don't have the book with me, but I am going to take a picture of it because I have it actually on my Twitter account. I post it so many times. So let me make sure I pull up the right thing, what it says on. I'm going to say what exactly I put on Twitter, because this is important to me. And this is important to me because of the simple fact that I wanted to know who was really in charge, right? His point here was that the Igigi, or Igigi, I've heard it said different words, were working class, right?
Yeah.
Well, according to the literature of ancient Sumer, so like I said, the same source that Billy Carson is going to use for gold, like the electronic text corpus of the Sumerian literature or the literature of ancient Sumer.
No, hold on, though, Rebirth. He analyzed the text.
Yeah.
He didn't. Yeah, he analyzed it himself. He didn't just read it. But go ahead.
So if he uses these sources, if he got the book, right, the hardcover version, right, and you go to the literature of ancient Sumer, the Igigi is not a working class. They are far from the working class. They are actually known as, and this is what it says in the back, and I'm going to post it in the video so people can see it. It says a collective name for the great gods.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Right.
Now, the Anunnaki, the Anuna slash the Anunnaki, it says it's a collective name for the gods.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Now, this is important to me because I've asked so many people, what does that mean to them?
Hmm.
Right. And if you really think about it,
Sounds like
okay,
the inverse to me.
explain.
Well, if one is a colloquial term for the great gods, and another one's a colloquial term for just the gods, it sounds like the great gods would be the hierarchy and not the other way around.
But why would they be toiling? Why would they be the
That
ones? Now
yeah,
that's another question. Whether,
sure.
you know what I mean, that goes into another whole argument. But they aren't known as the working hard class or the working class or
Yeah, that wouldn't make any sense.
right. And why would they be mining the gold and then for some people believe transporting it to Mars?
Yeah, is there now? I did a quick read. I downloaded the Inumu Elish. Um, I is there anything mentioned about Mars in there?
Well, it depends on like the words that he used. It depends on what they're using it for. Like how Marduk is known as a planet and also known as a
Okay.
god. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Right.
you know, with any god also has a relationship with the planet, right? So
Sure, and that goes back to antiquity for lots of different cultures.
yeah, so I mean, you can take that and create your own narrative from there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like were the Greeks actually, going to the planet Neptune when they were talking about Neptune?
Right. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
or but see, this is the thing. The Atrahasis,
yeah.
that's not the Sumerian civilization. Yeah, it may be used in the Sumerian cuneiform script, like I said before, but when the Akkadians took over the Sumerians,
Mm,
you know, the Sumerian civilization ceased to exist. They became the Akkadians. And
right,
then
right,
that's why
right,
we have the Babylonians, and that's why we have the Assyrians and the
right,
Hittites and so on and so forth, right?
right, right. I'm
We
glad you
can't
brought that up.
we can't take them and just say, oh, it's all the Sumerians.
Yeah. I did a deep dive on all the different, Babylonian cultures and the transitions. And I actually, while researching this, excuse me, came to realize that a lot of reliefs that are attributed to Sumerian are actually Assyrian. They're not Sumerian at all. The reliefs of the handbags and the eagle-faced winged gods, they all come from a palace in Nimrod in Assyria, which was northern Mesopotamia. And it's totally conflated today. Like anything that's cuneiform, anything that looks like that is Sumerian. But you bring up an excellent point. So yeah, that was actually Akkadian, the Atrahasis, huh?
Yes, well, it depends on the time. See, the time frame is so messed up because, like I said, when you go to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature and the literature of ancient Sumer, it gives you a time frame of 18th century BCE. That's when
Right.
most of the stuff was written. And then you got, after that stuff was written, that's when you get the epics and so on and so forth, right? In those same time period. So I don't like to put a date on it because and say which one because it's so hard to pinpoint it. I mean, you can find it in one city and say, yeah, this is it. But if you look down at their script and stuff, it's like a combination of different scripts in one in many ways, I do want to make this point on the show JRE. They did say Joe Rogan did use the word Sumer a lot, and I do want to
Yeah.
point this out. I understand why he used Sumer because he's not trying to combine everything as the Sumerians, but he actually is because Sumer was considered the Sumerians. Sumer was named after the Sumerians. At least that's what I understand. That Sumer comes from the Sumerians. But then it comes into the argument of what I talked about before of Sumer, Chaldea, and Shinar all being the same. And Chaldea was actually first in many ways, because
Yeah.
Babylon was the capital of Chaldea, or at least that's some of the arguments, and there's evidence for that. So to say that it was, Sumer or the Sumerians, it's hard to say that when you got the Chaldeans like right there. And it's really, I'm telling you, the evidence in it alone is a lot out there, because I really didn't pay attention to it until I met Peter. um you probably know him from the spaces too, until I met him. And then it was verified, like I said, when I got my 1873 Bible, when I said that last time. I was like,
Yeah, he would have been better off saying ancient Mesopotamia. Um, when he said that, actually, I think that's funny you brought that up. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you brought it up, when he said that, it sounded like someone at a foreign restaurant trying to order a dish in a language they don't know how to speak. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
He's like ancient Sumer. He was trying to put on airs or something like that, in my opinion. But again, that's Joe Rogan. That's him. It is what it is.
Yeah, and I like I said, I know why he did that, because he doesn't want to put everything as the Sumerians, but Sumer, from what I understand, is literally derived from the Sumerians. It wouldn't be Sumer without, because in reality, the Ubadians actually came before the Sumerians. We know that by their artifacts, right?
Yeah.
But then the Chaldeans are really mentioned throughout, and there are maps that go back, that's pre-World War I and II in our text that we talked about before. We like to read those type of books that show this stuff. So yeah.
Well, I think you're giving him more credit than I will. I think he was trying to put on airs. I don't think he was trying to be um, speaking in a broader sense. I don't really think he was going that deep. But we can agree to disagree on that one as far as what Joe Rogan's intent was. Um, I personally, wanted to do this space. I think I said it very early on, or not this space, but this interview, this podcast, very early on when we did our first recording, because of the fact that when Graham Hancock was on there and he had Flint Dibble, even though it was something that was planned and arranged, I think that Joe kind of stabbed his friend in the back a little bit during that. And so, I'm not willing to give Joe too much credit at this point. I don't like the way he treated Graham. And to have someone like Billy come on unquestioned, unvetted, just gobsmacking and going, "Oh gosh, wow, that's amazing," well, without questioning anything he has to say, I think is very hypocritical at this point.
I look at it like this, because when I showed you that they talked about gold in the electronic text corpus Sumerian literature, it does say they bring in gold to Nibiru, right? It clearly does say that. So if you believe that there's a planet Nibiru out there that orbits our sun every 3,600 years, right? Whether the Sumerians said it or not, because it's obviously not in the Sumerian text, at least not in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. You will take that part right there and use that as your narrative of what you believe, right? You will use that because it does say they're basically taking gold and bringing it to Nibiru for their god, right? So you'll be like, oh, well, see, it says it in electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. So I can understand why he uses that, but then now you have to prove to me where's actually Nibiru at. I understand that the Babylonians consider, or not, I believe it's the Babylonians that consider Jupiter as Nibiru, and some people, and there are kind of arguments that some people believe Marduk was Nibiru also. So with that, like I said, every god, every king on planet Earth had a relationship with constellations.
Oh yeah, 100%. We mentioned that just a bit ago. Like, how many cultures had gods named after planets, right? Especially in antiquity. The funny thing is, nobody ever attributes those cultures as coming from any of those planets, like the Greeks and the Romans. They had many gods attributed with planets, but nobody ever says that they came from a planet. But then when as you pointed out, there's some gods attributed to these different cultures in Mesopotamia associated with planets. All of a sudden, well, they came from that planet. I mean, I don't know how you make that leap. Nobody makes that leap with the Greeks and the Romans. So I think it's because it's so far back in antiquity. The cuneiform text is an oddity. It does look foreign or out of this world, so to speak. It's not written on papyrus. It's written on clay tablets. It's written in stone. It's impressive, but because something is impressive, I think a lot of people want to imbue all this mystery around it when, humans are humans. And this was a great, vast, sophisticated culture who had a religion, they had a society, they functioned very much like any other ancient culture did after them. But they had different names and different origin stories and different epics to explain their mortal coil on this earth. And I think that's fascinating in its own right, without making up stories about dying planets and atmospheres that need gold particles. And I understand it's exciting and it's titillating when you're first getting into this stuff, or you're just a layman and you're not into it too much, but you see some like History Channel show and you hear all this stuff and it's like, wow, that's really cool, and it draws a lot of people in. It may have very well drawn me in, but then when you get down to the real research and you start looking into it, you start learning that, well, that may not be true, but there's other things that are equally more fascinating that are true. And I think that's what's more important when I want to focus on. There's a term thrown around called the woo. I used to be called person who perpetrated woo, which is sort of the sci-fi made up beliefs about the ancient past. But until I really started digging down deep and doing more and more research, I decided to put the woo away and find the more interesting truths about antiquity. So we got one more video. We can cue it up and let's finish this off. And look forward to diving into the next 15 minutes for our next one.
Crazy is they go to war, they go to get ready to go to battle, and then Enki says, I have an idea that will stop this war. There's an existing being on this planet, existing, not something that doesn't exist, existing. We can add our essence to it with a slain god. So they're talking about taking the DNA or genetics from one of themselves and mixing it with the DNA of the hominid that was here. It's not specified whether it was, an ape man or anything, but they don't specify in the tablets, but to create a worker being. And they began to do this genetic modification, probably disconnecting some of our DNA, making genetic modifications to us to get us to take orders from them. They inserted something called a worship gene, which was just discovered recently, that human beings have a gene inside of them that can be turned on and turned off. It can be turned off in a laboratory setting. It can also be turned off with a magnetic field around your head. And when it's off, you don't want to worship anything outside of yourself. You look inside. And when it's on, you look to get something from the outside. So this is incredible.
I never heard of anything called the worship gene.
I've never heard of that in my life, but some of that stuff, I'm actually looking it up right now. Some of that stuff we covered earlier. I know we did about the creation of the human race. We definitely covered that earlier, so I don't really want to get into that again and rehash the same thing. I more so wanted to get into the second part of what he had to say. So let's see. Now, as far as the concept of a worship gene is an interesting discussion. Genesis Dean Hammer proposed the God gene hypothesis, suggesting that human spirituality is influenced by heredity. According to this hypothesis, a specific gene called the vesicular nominine transporter 2 predisposes individuals towards spiritual or mystic experiences. So again, I mean, this is taking something and from over here and then bringing it over there. So there's some kind of studies talking about questioning why human beings have faith, why they worship, why they believe in a higher power and all this stuff, because that's the human question, right? You know, what is our time on this earth? Is there a greater reason for us being here? Did someone place us here? Are we alone? These are all the greatest questions of humanity. And this conversation and these conversations do exist. But to take that and then sort of superimpose it upon the idea that the Anunnaki, studying all this, the history of all the different various hominids is well extended. Like Homo sapiens sapiens go back, I think, 300,000 years, something like that, at least. And then you have Homo Heidelberg and the Denisovans and the Neanderthal, you know, all these different hominid types. So even if you talk about the Anunnaki being around 200,000 years, there was still hominids around. So if we were already here, I mean, if we want to take that, if we want to play devil's advocate to this timeline, Homo sapiens sapiens were already here. You know, but as we talked about earlier with the different epics and, you know, taking the blood of a slain god and mixing it with a human to create a workforce. Yeah, it talks about that, but it definitely does not say they're primates. And it talks about, you know, just mixing blood, you know, not genetic modification. I mean, let's get real, you know, genetic modification. I mean, come on, like breaking down the DNA. This goes back to the very early conversation we were having about the Catechus and the Nigizada and all that stuff. Like, yeah, it's two spiraling snakes, but it's a double helix. Like, really, they had electron microscopes like 200,000 years ago. Oh, right, but they were aliens, so that's why they had them. Sorry,
Well,
you know, I mean, it just gets silly.
I do want to point this out because you did mention different species. I do want to clarify, from what I understand, Homo sapiens actually go back 300,000 years. Homo sapiens sapiens, I think they say we go back 200,000 or
okay, yeah, you're right,
something like that.
Right.
But the point is that there's different species, right? And they're so identical to the point where they can't even they have to look at, you know, very detailed things in the bone structure to see what species belong to what. And in many cases, and I taken an anthropology class from edx.org, and they actually talk about how you can see like one species may have a Homo erectus jawbone but a Neanderthal type head or something, and it's hard for them to identify the difference. But anyway, creating new species, it wouldn't be hard for somebody like let's just say a Neanderthal grabbing a Homo erectus and a Homo sapien and making them breed, like how animals breed today, like how we create new dogs today and new cows and sheeps like that.
Sure.
If the DNA is close enough, that's a way of creating a new species, right?
Yeah, like a liger, like how a donkey was made.
Yeah,
all these type of things. But
And
that's just breeding.
Yeah, but that could be their understanding of how they did it, though. And we're taking our modern advanced technology and applying how we would do it today.
Mm.
You know what I mean? instead of being thinking like, hey, these people would take animals and literally make them breed until they created a new species and forced it,
Sure.
just like how they're doing it today.
Yeah, of course.
So that's
Absolutely.
and that's why I can say that, okay, they had, I don't know, somebody in their species that they wanted, that they try to make them breed with their species, right? Like just creating. I mean, it can get
When
that
you
dark.
say they, though, you mean the people of Mesopotamia?
Yeah, like whoever the Anuna were, or how they try to describe the creation. Like they don't. It doesn't necessarily have to be extraterrestrials coming from space doing that. It can literally be a different species of animals. Hey, like they're in the middle of a war and saying they're
Yeah.
taking our people and breeding new people and stuff. Like, mythical
Yeah.
stories.
Well, I mean, I could see what you're saying. Like, the big question is like, how did Neanderthal get wiped out, right?
Well, maybe
Um,
maybe they didn't. Maybe they say we have, almost everybody on this planet has some type of Neanderthal in them, right? Maybe the
well, to your
genetics
yeah,
changed.
to your point is that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. Thank you for correcting me. Not Homo sapiens sapiens, but Homo sapiens overlap. They find now for about 50,000 years, and this is all over Northern Europe, different regions, not Mesopotamia at all. This is the broader scope of things. So it could be that in a fight for civilization and resources, that we outbred them, so to speak. To your point of creating a new being, a hybrid being, or whatever, you know that may be part of the history of humanity. But to say that God's you know genetically modified our DNA is imagination.
Yeah.
It's imagination. And quite frankly, that is from Zachariah Sitchin. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. He says in the very beginning, I don't listen to Zachariah Sitchin. And then he gets into the first 7 minutes are this, that, and the other thing. And then the last 7 minutes are all Zachariah Sitchin talking points. So which one is it? Do you listen to him or do you not listen to him?
Right, right.
That would be my question to Billy. Which one is it?
Well, like I just feel like because he puts a lot of, um I guess you can say, uh faith in the Zachariah Sitchin's work, and this doesn't necessarily believe everything, probably. um he uses, okay, if Zachariah Sitchin says they're extraterrestrials, he believes in extraterrestrials. He also believes in God, also a creator, at least. He would say, okay, well, this is the closest text that would give me to the extraterrestrial idea, and that would be it. But there is no text that actually says anything about them coming from a planet Nibiru. That's the only thing that gets me, is that um Nibiru, yes, it's mentioned, but other places are mentioned too.
Right.
And it's because of the gods. And like I said, when you using the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, or the book that I mentioned a lot, it's hard to really grasp what the actual Sumerians said. Because remember, in the first videos, he talked about how these pieces are broken off, right? Well, that's to
Yes.
fill in the blanks. And I
Right.
think that's what the fill in the blanks are, is that their narrative is that. But let's take away those chips and go with what we do know. If there are 50,000 to 100,000 different cuneiform tablets, artifacts, cylinders, and so on and so forth, why isn't there one of them that actually says Planet Nibiru? In most cases, most people will use, and Zachariah Sitchin used cylinder seal VA 243 as saying this extra dot is actually Planet Nibiru. But on the inscriptions or in the writing on it, it doesn't say anything about Nibiru. So where is out of that 50,000, like it has to be something that says that, just without just believing in somebody else's work and what they possibly seen in art, in what I would call a pictographic script or a cylinder. You know, I want to know more about that because that cylinder does hold weight to a lot of people when it comes up to Planet Nibiru. That's
Yeah.
like their go-to thing.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think we talked about this earlier. The planets and constellations and things like that were well known to the ancients. This is not some great revelation that this happened to be on this cylinder seal. I mean, um, the ancient Egyptians, studied the night sky like we watch television today. Like it was an every night occurrence. They knew all the heavenly bodies. They knew how they moved. And this, they created the first zodiac, and this went on to the Greeks, and then the Romans. That's how they, and probably the Egyptians, um, were in succession with the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia. So this is a long lineage of. In the modern world, we just don't get it, right? We just can't comprehend. No artificial light, no artificial light whatsoever. And it sounds stupid to say, but no electronics, nothing, nothing. You had nothing. You had the three-dimensional world around you, and you had fire to light the darkness. And when the sun went over the horizon, man, it was pitch black all around this planet. There was no light pollution. There was nothing. The heavens, the nightly sky was the prime time TV. That was it. All they did was look at the heavens all the time. They studied it. They had nothing else to do. They had an intelligent mind just like yours and mine. They had a fully developed modern brain, but they had none of the acumens that we have today. None, zero. So when the sun went over the horizon, that was it. And they knew all of these planets, all of the heavens. They could track comets. I mean, it sounds incredible, but it was basically very normal. It was very normal to them, because it was something they did for thousands of years. And this is one of the deals where Joe Rogan wants to do all the ooh and ah. Well, I'll do an ooh and ah right now. For thousands of years, all people did was look at an unfettered night sky and study it. So I think people should think back to what it was like to be in those times and how fascinating and amazing that particular is. I mean, look at all the monuments that are aligned with the spring equinox, the spring and summer equinox, the spring, fall equinox, summer, solstice, winter solstice. All those monuments that are aligned specifically when the sun is going to rise at a specific point. That's because they knew this stuff in the back of their hand, like a stopwatch. Like uh, that is incredible. That's fascinating on its own merit, and it doesn't need aliens. It doesn't need spaceships. Uh, it it needs us to recognize the inner genius that we have as a species and how we just can't see it anymore because we can't see past the screen on our iPhone.
I have to agree with you. As enlightened that some of these people say they are, they believe aliens gave us this knowledge. And I'm gonna be honest with you. So through my journey, uh me and my wife had a son, and my son has autism, right? And both my kids can read. He's he's just up a lot, like he runs around the house right now and stuff like that. He's just very active, right? He can't speak, he's speech delayed, but both my kids can read. And that kind of shocked me because I never used to read before. When I was young, I used to be the TV person. Now I read a lot more than I watch TV, of course. But um, I had to, I couldn't understand how somebody that couldn't speak could read. Like he can read
Mm.
a book like holding a conversation, right? Hold on. And it's so I was doing some research into it, right? And I wanted to know more about autism, and then eventually I learned about savant syndrome.
Yeah.
And but savant syndrome, I'm sure you already know about it, is these individuals are intelligent
Right.
to the point where you would think that they had extraterrestrial intelligence.
Yeah.
Individuals that can calculate math faster than a calculator.
Right.
Accurate, right? People who can fly over cities for 15, 20 minutes and draw a complete canvas of the city and have it more accurate than Google, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that this intelligence, like you said, somebody who's looking at the night sky all the time, right? They have autism, they're up, there's no TV, there's nothing else to keep their attention but that sky.
That's it.
That's it. So they study it, they memorize it, they study it. Then they start applying it to agriculture because we talked about those places called the Adam calendar, right?
Yeah.
And we both came up with one of the sites that was a cow enclosure area. Well, cows have to do with agriculture. Those constellations were they used for agricultural needs, and that's why they set it up there as a
Sure.
representation. I mean, I don't know the answer, but that could be a possibility because Pleiades, like I mentioned about Pleiades, when Dr. Michael S. Heiser talks about it on Cylinder Sylvia 243, when you look at the Pleiades star system, that's usually around the time they start doing agriculture,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah, so it just makes me wonder, like all these places, you know, what is the real relationship with it? Because it seems like everything goes back to agriculture, right? Everything goes back to agriculture. Why else would somebody be wanting to pay attention to the sky? Well, for one, they want to know when it's going to be the rainy season, right?
Right.
They know when floods are going to happen because they every civilization has a flood story. So now, how do we prevent floods or be prepared for floods? Well, now let's learn about the star system that's associated with those floods, right? What causes these floods? So they're going to be looking at the sky because that's just going to be natural, right? When is the best time to plant seeds for the agriculture needs, right? Sun. You
Right.
need most of the sun. You need the rainy season and stuff like that. So, like you said, the heavens, the sky, that was their bread and butter. That's what got them to the point where they went from hunters and gatherers to what we are today. And that's
Absolutely.
right there should be amazing because it took somebody to do hard work and figure this out over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And to give credit to something outside of that is saying, hey, okay, I might can't do that. So I don't think anybody else would have had the ability to do
Exactly.
that. And that's taken away the actual history of us. I wholeheartedly believe in aliens, extraterrestrial life. But I think that if they came here and they were 500,000 years more advanced than we are, then I would probably believe that we would probably be way better off here, especially if they're supposedly supposed to still be here, according to some people, right? So it goes into this whole conspiracy theory and all these arguments about, okay, why are we taking away our own intelligence? Why are we dumbing ourselves down?
I have no
I've
idea.
heard people say, well, we don't build pyramids like that today, like we did back in the day. Well, did they know that some of the biggest pyramids are in the United States and one of them is a Bass Pro Shop? You know what I mean? Yeah, it's not made out of the bricks, but we used our modern technology just like they did. They didn't use
Yeah.
you remember they built mud huts right back then, right? They still do in some cases. Some people still what we call them mud huts, right? They're not going to build a monument out there. They're going to use the most advanced technology to build something that's going to last for them there. And that's no difference than what we would do too. Why would we build something back in the way? And in many cases, we still build things like pyramids. And today, there's cedar blocks or whatever they call them, how they use those big old blocks to build certain construction buildings and stuff like that. I mean, we use a certain technology.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, we have different technology. We have skyscrapers. We
Yeah.
have spacecraft. We have all that kind of stuff. Um, I want to go back to what you're saying about agriculture and the heavens and things like that. You're absolutely correct. And it differed between hemispheres. If you lived in the northern hemisphere, you needed to know when it was going to start getting cold. You needed to know when winter was coming, because winter meant death, right? So it became an important point of emphasis to figure out, how the hell am I going to figure this shit out? Because they didn't have clocks, they didn't have a calendar, they didn't have a months of the year that said it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. They just had days. And one day it was that day, and one day it was that day. Then all of a sudden, somehow it started getting fucking cold. Well, how are they going to tell when it was getting cold? How? What were their markers going to be? Now you could say, okay, when the leaves started falling off the trees or whatever. Well, when's that going to happen? Right? Because all of a sudden it's summer, and then it's spring or fall, and then it's not.
Yeah, when am I going to be
Right?
able to prepare for all that?
Right. So what do? They use the heavens, they use the stars, they use the sun, they use the moon. They use that to calculate, okay, we need enough supplies. We need enough animal meat. We need enough stores. We need enough this. We need enough that in order to survive this winter, or else my children are going to die. I'm not going to survive. We're going to freeze to death. Right. So survival, to some extent, made our ancient peoples look for a way to figure out when this stuff was going to happen. So yeah, I mean, credit to them, and not to aliens, man. I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, that's the only thing that gets me. It's like, I think it takes away a lot from the alien community, and the community for people who truly want to understand our historical past. If it was truly aliens, there will definitely be evidence that's going to be that way, and it will be presented in the future. But right now, I mean, everything that I've learned, when we started nurturing people with disabilities, we started to really take off as a group of individuals. Back in the day, when you read the old Greek manuscript or text and stuff, the disabled, they didn't last long.
No.
No. And if you weren't a warrior, I mean, you couldn't stay there. You had to either be killed off or banished, and which eventually led to death anyway, right?